I feel like a bit of an interloper in a very kind of important debate about Dutchness and blackness. And in a way, what I'm going to do is kind of bypass that and widen the scale a little bit to talk about blackness in a transnational context with a lot of Anglo references, so I apologize. Before I sort of do my thing, I'd like to thank Benno, Remy, and Iris for involving me in this very, very important project, which I think is really going to, as we can see already, is opening up discourse and important conversations. But also I'd like to just quickly say that I want to dedicate this lecture to Alana Lockwood, Sister Alana Lockwood, who we lost this year, and also Busy Silva. Two amazing foundational women who really, I think, have opened up many of the questions that we're talking about today. So, I want to start, just talk a bit about the measurement of presence, and I want to start with Stanley Brown. I don't have, can we, okay. The other side. Okay. I want to start with Stanley Brown. And I want to quickly read, if I may, from the catalogue essay by Jan debat. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce his name, I'm sorry. The curator of the Pavilion in 1982, of course. Because I think it really gives a measure of the way that the text was written, it really reflects the kind of work that Stanley was doing. So, he says, 34 works by Stanley Brown have been selected for exhibition in the Dutch Pavilion at the 40th Venice Biennale. They cover the period from 1960 to the present and represent significant moments in the development of Brown's work. They are shown here in chronological order. Brown concentrates on walking distances and on measuring distances, themes which he's focused on the reciprocity of the concepts of distance and the unit of measurement. He always proceeds in an orderly, consistent fashion, as though carrying out scientific investigation, dealing with each aspect of a problem in turn, and examining the results as to their usefulness in the total logical structure. And then he goes on to mention the works. Work number one, Steps of Pedestrians on Paper, 1960, on paper. Work number two, Steps of Pedestrians on Paper, 1960, on paper. Work number three, Steps of Pedestrians on Paper, 1960, on paper. Work number four, Steps of Pedestrians on Paper, 1960, on paper. Work number five, Steps of Pedestrians on Paper, 1960, on paper. Work number six, Steps of Pedestrians on Paper, 1960. You get the kind of the vibe. Just really quickly, another quick quote. Stanley Brown first exhibited his card system, as you can see here, at Art and Project in Amsterdam in 1972. The theme of these card systems includes measuring distances and marking off distances. The form of presentation was chosen so as to provide optimum readability of the distances, etc., etc. And then he talks about work number 18. In this work, 1,000 times the length of 1 foot step is measured. The length of each step is noted as a number of millimeters in the card system. In contrast to the steps in work number 17, which are recorded as lines, what is shown as a line in 17 is noted as a number of millimeters in 18. The steps are measured as follows. A 10 meter length of paper, millimeter 10th of paper is fixed to the floor. A short stretch of 8 to 12 footsteps is placed on the paper, etc., etc. Brown's pavilion, by some accounts, was not particularly well perceived, or received, sorry, and has stayed relatively under the radar until now, in some respects. In 1982, the ghosts of high conceptualism had been fully exorcised by the fulsome return of neo-expressionist painting and postmodern prestige and the proliferation of images. The postmodern politics of identity was in full swing in the 80s, right? The catalogue, in keeping with the wishes and instructions of the artists, contains, of course, no biographical information and no images of the artist. The artist's body, in some senses, is infused in every minute detail of all the works in the pavilion, right? Some of which I mentioned just now. his body providing a universal basis of measurement. In other senses, his body, his visual material identity, his presence, is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. There's a play of presence and absence in the work which extends ad infinitum across perceptual and geographical spaces and temporalities. The work is marked, in a sense, by a radical refusal of a binary presence. You're either here or there, you're either black or white. The work is also entirely and radically, I would say, transnational, and extends across and beyond multiple geographies and time-space coordinates, almost spiritual in its quest for universality, or more accurately, universalities in plural. That was Venice in 1982. In light of this, coming forward to today, the Dutch Pavilion in 2019 is asking the question, how do we measure presence? How do we measure the presence of artists, particularly black artists, artists from Suriname, in the art world or in the world? How do we measure the works produced by black artists? This question, the question in effect, perhaps posed, maybe not, by the curator and the artists of the Dutch Pavilion in Venice, is one that I want to attempt to answer as a way of understanding how black artists and their works have been framed and positioned in discourses of modern and contemporary art, the question that I was asked to consider for this project. This question of presence, I think, is particularly crucial at a time when many people across the world are questioning the presence and even the existence of black people in the face of a global racist onslaught in the era of Trump, Brexit, and the rise of populist anti-migrant and anti-black racisms and movements on both sides of the Atlantic. We're living in a time when the spectacle of Black death and the assaults on black bodies are constantly flashing up on our screens, right? Social media screens, and even in art galleries. Think of the Diana Schutz controversy. A global movement asserting that Black lives matter has emerged, and academics are debating such existential issues as the ontology of black life and black death. People like Fred Moten, Saidiya Hartman, etc. Within the context of art, there's an increasing number of exhibitions, museum initiatives, publications, and research projects that explicitly address and advocate for the inclusion and recognition of the black presence in the mainstream in order to rectify and challenge the historical and ongoing forms of exclusion of black artists. To name just a few of the most prominent, we can think about the multi-volume work, The Image of the Black in Western Art, led by Professor Henry Louis Gates at Harvard. You might think about the Global Black Portraitures Conferences, organized by Deb Willis-Thomas and NYU, New York University. There was also, in 2014-2015, the major touring exhibition called Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art, curated by Valerie Castle-Oliver, in which, by the way, the conceptual artist Adrian Piper famously refused to be part of, right? She said, no, I don't want to be part of that exhibition. And in Britain, we can think about the research and archival projects which I've been involved in, Black Artists in Modernism, and Making Histories Visible, led by the artists Sonia Boyce and Lubena Himid. And as well as, I'm sure, many other initiatives in the Netherlands, some of which Charles talked about, but which you're all familiar with. In this context, the question of the measurement of presence takes on a particularly poignant and urgent meaning. It can be argued that it is particularly significant to ask this question in the context of art and on the occasion of the historical selection of two black artists of Surinamese origin for the Dutch Pavilion in Venice. The location of this debate today in the historic space of the Black Archives, a crucial location in the measurement of the Surinamese and black presence in the Netherlands, also arguably adds to the weight and importance of this question and the fact that it's being asked now in the Netherlands. So, how can we measure black presence? And how can we measure the presence of black artists in the art world? Should indeed this question be framed in this way? In other words, around questions of blackness, race, and identity, notwithstanding the urgency of the times that we're living in. I want to think about this question in relation to how artists have approached, in relation to how artists have approached it. Think of Stanley Brown, for example. The question has always had a special resonance for black and minority artists, as the black presence in a racist society has always, as I've mentioned, been subject to a binary disciplinary regime fixed around modes of inclusion or exclusion. You're either in or you're out, right? You're visible or you're invisible. You're either materiality or immateriality. What happens if this mode of measuring black presence, this binary mode, is refused? What happens when the disciplinary logics of defining black art through criteria of inclusion and exclusion, are subverted through a radical refusal or opacity that is embedded not only in the actions of the artist, as in Stanley Brown, but also embedded in the artwork itself? I want to argue that there is a critical genealogy of black artists' radical practice of resisting and denying full presence, or the binary logic of presence, through a play on and blurring of the relation between presence and absence, inclusion and exclusion. This tradition of radical refusal also engages a transnational or trans modality or methodology, and I'll explain that in a minute, that brings different worlds into relation. This is what I want to discuss in my talk today, and also in the essay that I'm still working on. I'm editing it as we speak. This critical genealogy that starts with Stanley Brown, in my opinion, at least in its contemporary guise, forces us to reckon with the presence of the work of art itself and what the work of art does in and to the world, measured not in relation to how black it is or how modern it is, but rather how it brings other worlds into relation through a critical transnational orientation and a relation to opacity that refuses to be measured by the pseudo-universalism of the Western rationalist colonial gaze. Right? Yes. So, I want to talk a bit about the history of refusal. Before I speak in more detail about this critical transnational orientation, I want to speak about an idea that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly in America, unfortunately, sorry to go back to the States, about the relation of black artists to what was termed at the time the theatre of refusal. The notion of a theatre of refusal as a way of characterizing the environment of rejection, disavowal, and fear that many black artists, are forced to practice in, was first suggested to me by my colleague Sonia Boyce. Unfortunately couldn't come today. We normally fight, and that would have been a really good spectacle, but unfortunately we're not witnessing that. Sonia suggested this to me many years ago in one of our many intense but illuminating discussions about the structure and development of black art. The term itself, theatre of refusal, comes from an important essay and exhibition of the same title by the American conceptual artist Charles Gaines, staged at the University of California, Irvine Fine Arts Gallery in 1993. Gaines organized the exhibition with the aim of challenging and bringing to light the critical response of art critics, writers, and historians. Maybe we should do this in Holland, actually. This is a good idea. To the artistic production of African-American artists in the 1980s, right? So you basically organized an exhibition where you had works, conceptual works by artists in one set of rooms, and then responses by critics to those works in another set of rooms. And so you walk through the exhibitions looking at these responses and how they juxtapose with the works of art. Now, Gaines, this period, of course, was marked in the 1980s was by the growth of multiculturalism and the opening of art institutions to greater diversity, right, in the US art world. In the exhibition, Gaines juxtaposed works by people like Jean-Michel Basquiat, René Green, David Hammons, Ben Patterson, Adrian Piper, Sandra Rowe, Lorna Simpson, Karen May Weems, Fred Wilson, all of these names I'm sure familiar to many of you. And he juxtaposed that with recently published commentaries on their work. Right? How about that? The works were in one set of rooms, and excerpts and published writings by critics were literally displayed on the walls in another room, so that it could be compared in relation to the artwork. The disjuncture and distortion between much of the writing on the artworks themselves was an important element of this exhibition. As the writer and curator Maurice Berger noted in the catalogue essay, quote, "The exhibition's litany of distortions calls to mind a concept that is improbable as it is absurd, the blind art critic. Yet the evidence would support a diagnosis of the kind of hysterical vision of disturbance suggested by Fanon." That's from Maurice Berger's essay in the catalogue of the exhibition. To cite a few more distortions noted by Berger, for example, Adrian Piper, the artist, was accused by one writer of being an upper-class white woman who passes for black in order to, quote, project her own obsession with race into the environment. According to another white critic, Lorna Simpson's photographs were suspected of harboring, quote, secret semiotics, deliberately creating a puzzle in a secret language, a language presumably beyond the reach of white critics, right? While Jean-Michel Basquiat's work was said to appeal to collectors because his work, quotes, resonates with the aura of the primitive unleashed. The list goes on, right? Where critic after critic framed the work of these black artists almost exclusively in terms of social and political terms, in any terms other than the work of art itself. The work of black artists as works of art becomes effectively invisible to the white critical infrastructure. In his important essay in the catalogue, Gaines sums up the relation. Between black artists and mainstream criticism in the following way. The critical environment surrounding these works of these artists intentionally and unintentionally limit those works, creating a theatre of refusal that punishes the work of black artists by making it immune to history and by immunizing history against it. The status of the mainstream is vigorously maintained, not only by the discourse of the authorial voice, modernism, but by a politics that surreptitiously introduces the other through a dialectical framework. That's Charles Gaines's essay in the catalogue. The theatre of refusal Gaines identifies in its exhibition in text relate in some respect to the debates around postmodernism that was current at the time, and in post-structuralist art criticism by critics and writers who ostensibly, on the surface, were actually supportive. These were critics who were supportive of questions of marginality and otherness, perceived to have been adopted by some African-American artists as Adrian Piper, Gary Simmons, or Fred Wilson. These artists' works often challenge racism through the deployment of language-based, discursive, and conceptual art-driven strategies. However, Gaines shows how these writers contributed to the exclusion of black art, or rather works by black artists, from the mainstream through a litany of misreadings. Does it sound familiar? A closing down of perspectives, a separation of aesthetic from political judgments, a series of misrecognitions, overdeterminations of reading artworks through a primarily social and contextual lens. Gaines's early analysis of refusal was conceived by him very much as a critique of the white art world's exclusion of black artists from mainstream criticism. Now, in more recent years, I would argue that the question of refusal has been framed in a very different way by a generation of artists and critics who reject the binary concerns of attempting to be included in the white arts mainstream or canon. This refusal can be seen as a form of embracing opacity, which I'll talk a bit more about later, or another way of relating artworks, the works of black artists, to presence in the art world. So much of this politics of refusal is linked to the perceived institutionalization, this is a key, I think, point, of the black presence in the art world. In other words, the black presence has been institutionalized, right? When presence is linked to institutionalization, it gets caught in the web of institutional politics that further obscures aesthetic considerations. In other words, presence of black artists in their works becomes subsumed under the weight of the logic of inclusion, the need to include, the need to diversify, the need to integrate. The nearer blackness it comes to the center, to the modern, to respectability, the more it becomes visible and thus legitimate, but it becomes an archetype of representation. There's an economy and politics of representation at work, where the struggle for black artists for recognition in the art world becomes intertwined with the struggle for visibility and representation. This is often reflected in art practices that centre on, and I'm not necessarily being critical of this, I'm just stating how it is, that these representational practices often focus on the centre on the black body, the material and corporal presence of black people or black lives. Curator Nav Huck, oh, I haven't got that critic. Oh, okay, I thought I had a text by Nav Huck. I'm going to read it. Recently and critically commented on the recent resurgence of the politics of representation in the field of art in what he terms identity art or identity politics. He says, some artists are operating in the old paradigm of 1980s legitimation, but some are raising prospects of a wholesale shift in the consideration of identity and subjectivity in the artistic realm, working in a way that is more complex than the art system has been able or willing to accommodate. So the global art world is essentially a colonial system, and an entry and visibility in this system is invariably based on a mimetic logic of similitude, right, of being similar to the modern or to the West. In other words, the standards of modernism or contemporaneity serve as legitimization machines that have now become decentered across the globe through international biennials and the new geographies of circulation in contemporary art. Indeed, contemporary art in many respects has extended this power logic inherited from colonial modernism and infused and updated it within the guise of the free market. The visibility and centrality of difference, representation, identity are indeed at the core, the very core of the functioning of the global art market. So, I want to postulate that perhaps new frameworks for the measurement of works by black artists are needed. I think we need new frameworks. For me, these frameworks will have to be configured through a critical transnational multiplicity that beyond the restrictive frame of institutional modernism or on the one hand, institutional modernism on the one hand, or market-led contemporaneity on the other. I want to think about transnational as a way to think through the measurement of presence of black artworks, not black artists, in the world. But to do that, we need to rethink transnational as a more radical category than the way that it's currently used. And for me, the key point is in relation to the trans element in the transnational. Allow me to explain what I mean. I think the first point I want to establish about this is that the very idea of the transnational has a notion of flux, movement, and flow in its very constitution, right? And this element of flow, flux, and constant change is embodied in the prefix trans. The etymology of trans, and according to the Oxford English Dictionary, I'm sorry for the language, but it's based on, trans is based on the idea of moving across, beyond, through, and changing states, transcending. Trans implies continual movement from one place to another, or from one state of being to another. A kind of flow that can be applied to the notion of objects that go across contexts and change their state or ontology as they cross geographical and cultural contexts. So, just a quick history of the word transnational, really quickly. In the 19th century, the word transnational emphasized a kind of a linguistic and utopian basis by describing how national languages is applied in terms of language, and linguistic communities crossed borders, right? But coming into the 1960s, I'm really kind of moving very quickly, the term was often used in neoliberal policy circles to describe the activities of so-called transnational corporations. Do you remember those? As the global economy began to expand in the wake of post-war Pax Americana. In the 80s and 90s, sociologists, anthropologists, and other social scientists began to describe the rise of a global culture and the information technology revolution in terms of the concept of flows and to delineate the growing fluidity and deterritorialization of culture. In the field of art, the period after 1960 kind of witnessed a shift from an internationalist perspective based on relations between states behind secure national borders to new states of being and doing in art that reflected a borderless sense of global flows, connecting people and artists through increasingly complex and multiple webs, nodes, and networks. Theorists and critics of globalization mapped this underlying transformation of capitalist space-time in concepts such as space-time compression from David Harvey, the cultural logic of late capitalism from Frederick Jameson, and the global space of flows, Castells. Bear with me, sorry, this is a really boring theory part. In fact, I might move on from this a little bit. But what I'm basically saying is that there was a shift in the 60s and 70s from art as object in the international paradigm to art as event and process, right? The move towards global conceptualisms, performance, kinetic art, participation, body art, philosophies of forms of art making that began to engage forms and philosophies of flow, of flux and movement in their ontological status of constitution. The shift from international to transnational understandings of art partly reflected these developments and reconceptualizations. Sorry, this is a bit late in the evening to be talking in very academic terms. In a very important text called The Global, in my opinion, The Global Work of Art, 2016, art historian Caroline Jones quite usefully traces this shift from international to transnational to the 1960s moment in Latin American, specifically Brazilian art, where artists such as Ligia Clark and Helio Oiticica began to challenge the international modernism of the early generation of artists, many of whom were influenced by European modernists such as Max Bill, you can see here. So Bill, for example, wanted to produce objects, wanted to do solid objects that render abstract thought visible, okay? And he was very influenced by the idea of the Mobius strip. You can see that in this work here, Endless Form. But in the 60s, this Euro-modernist influence began to be challenged by a younger group of artists. And the work that Jones mentions emblematic of this is this work by Clark and Oiticica in 66, called the Diálogo de Mãos, the Dialogue of Hands. This work was a simple strip of commercially produced lactic, cut and folded to produce a Mobius strip that challenged the static modernism of concrete art by introducing a participatory, kinetic, and playful dynamic that Oiticica described, and I think it's really interesting, as a trans object, right? A trans object. The term trans object reflected an ontological shift in the nature and understanding of what art is and what it can do in a global art world, which is a new way of understanding art, influenced as he was by theories of phenomenology and object relations at the time, blah, blah, blah. I go into a little bit there. Jones argues that this new language for making art opened up perspective. This is the key point that I wanted to make. She calls these perspectives, new perspectives, tactics of the trans. Tactics of the trans. In other words, forms of art making and curatorial practice that cut across the rigid vertical hierarchies of the international and the framing of world pictures in the international to embrace an alternate form of horizontal relation and energy evidenced in non-object and process-based artworks. That I find quite interesting, right? So the question my research asks, how long have I got, by the way? 5 minutes? Okay. The question my research asks, I'm kind of moving on, is what can be tactics of the trans today? Of moving across, moving beyond, changing states. And how might we begin to reconfigure the notion of trans objects to speak of progressive notions of trans and transnational in the context of the global crisis that we face today around inequality, aggressive nationalisms, etc. Where is the energy to formulate new ideas of the trans coming from today? In other words, right, so, and in some respects, which I won't talk about today because I'm still working on it, I think it can be seen perhaps in the work of the two artists in this exhibition. So just to kind of really move on very quickly. It's not very trans here, is it? Right, okay. So much of my thinking around this. It's okay, that's okay. I'm jumping. I'm moving over a bit of material here. For me, what I'm trying to do, I think, is to activate the trans in transnational. And I want to do that by rethinking transnationalism, to think about how trans as flow and fluidity in art are being challenged and shaped by insurgent, radical perspectives informed by thinkers both from the global south and the margins of the West, in particular Black studies. In other words, how can a radical, decolonial, or decolonizing, non-patriarchal vision of trans be developed in relation to forms of theory which have been relatively marginal to the concerns of art until recently? I'm thinking here, for example, of intersectional and Black feminisms, of the writings of someone like Saidiya Hartman, for example, Gloria Wecker. Caribbean post-colonial thought, Glisson, Sylvia Wynter. Queer theory, trans theory, of course, and gender fluidity in the writings of people like Jack Halberstam, Sarah Ahmed, and critical Black studies in the work of people like Christina Sharp, Fred Moten. For the sake of time, I want to mention one example which I think is important, which is Glisson, Edouard Glisson's ideas around the poetics of relation and opacity, which I've talked about before ad infinitum, and I will continue talking about. In his seminal text, Poetics of Relation, not this one, this is Caribbean Discourse, an earlier text, Glisson argues, but he also argues it in this text, for what he calls a right to opacity, a form of non-understanding in the relations between the global south and the global north. The dominant forms of globalization of the neoliberalist regimes always demand an aggressive transparency. We want to know about you. We want to know anything you're doing. We want to know everything about you, right? You need to be transparent. And he says that the right to opacity challenges and disrupts this unequal structuring in the flow of power. It changes the terms of the conversation and potentially opens up new forms of exchange and relation that are not based on dominant notions of transparency. Is that what Stanley did by refusing to be categorized under the terms of biography of the artist? Just a quick, by way of conclusion, I was going to show you some other stuff, but by way of conclusion, because I'm trying to draw it together, I think trans in the way that I want to use it is coming from the transnational mobilities and thinking about relationality from the global south. Trans tactics have emerged, they're still resolving in the works and actions of artists like Brown and also David Hammond, who I talk about at length in other texts. And I think they are emerging as broader creative strategies of art-making, curatorial practice that are influenced by many writers. For Caroline Jones, in the way she used it, trans are strategies of art-making that are out of the frame. In other words, beyond modernism and a narrow internationalism and world picturing of modernity. Her description of trans breaks with modernism, but it remains firmly within the art historical, teleological, West-centric art history, okay, with the move to participatory art and global conceptualism. The way that I want to occupy trans draws on non-Western thoughts and modes of relationality that refuses the institutional logic of art history that come from the Black radical tradition. In other words, to be outside of the frame, for me, in this sense, means not only outside the frame of modernist art, but also outside the frame of Western colonial epistemologies, to think about how trans objects and trans operations can bring worlds into relation and new worlds into being through opacity and blurring. I don't have time to talk about blurring, it's another thing to open up. Beyond the linearities and binaries of global history. To end, I will say that I think that Remy Jungerman and Iris Kensmil's work in this pavilion, curated by Benno Tempel, has the potential to open up a new space of relation as a mediator of and between worlds, geographical, aesthetic, and moral. In the case of Jungerman, this takes the form of the development of a specific artistic vocabulary that takes cultural translation as a modus operandi. The trans here becomes a method in Remy's work. His sculptures operate in the world as difference modulators, enabling the multiple layering of modernist legacy, vintage spirituality, and transcultural sensibilities, without setting up or conforming to the institutionally imposed hierarchies of Western norms. With Iris, I think she sets up a visual and painterly dialogue of abstraction throughout her work, bringing blackness and feminism in relation to modernism, not as a form of flattery, of homage or imitation, but as a way of opening up new ways of seeing blackness and modernism beyond the usual institutional frames. I think there's a quiet work, a quiet opacity in the, I was talking about that before, a quiet opacity in the work of Iris, in the deployment of what I would call modes of radical relationality or trans tactics that bring new worlds into new relation. I'll end there. Thank you.